You don't belong here. This courtroom isn't for people like you. His voice was sharp, laced with arrogance, each word deliberately drawn out to maximize its impact. The officer stood tall, uniform perfectly pressed, badge gleaming under the harsh white lights of the courtroom. His posture was one of complete authority, of absolute control. His gaze, piercing and condescending, locked onto the woman before him as if she were nothing more than a nuisance, a mistake, an intrusion that needed to be handled. She didn't respond. Not yet. The room was packed. Rows of attorneys, clerks, jurors, and members of the public lined the benches, their faces a mix of amusement, indifference, and silent curiosity. Some had seen this kind of moment unfold before, a black woman being put in her place, reminded of the hierarchy of power that ruled spaces like this. Others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. The judge sat at his elevated bench, barely giving the interaction a second glance, as if this was a trivial distraction from the case at hand. The officer took a step closer, his boots clicking against the polished wooden floor. He smirked, sensing no resistance from her, no immediate retaliation. This was the moment he relished, the moment where his power was absolute, where his word was law, where he could strip someone of their dignity with nothing but his voice and his authority. You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want? His voice was loud, intentionally carrying across the room so that everyone could hear, so that everyone would see him putting her in her place. You think your kind gets a say in how the law works? He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You people always think you're smarter than the system. But not today. Not in my courtroom. He turned away from her, addressing the judge with a smug confidence. Your Honor, this individual is interfering with the legal process and has no business being here. I request that she be removed immediately. The judge, without looking at her, gave a nod of approval. It was done. The gavel slammed. Bailiff, remove her from the courtroom. The words hung heavy in the air, final and unchallenged. The officer stepped forward, slow and deliberate, allowing the moment to stretch. He wanted her to feel this. He wanted her to understand her place. He reached for her arm, the gesture slow, patronizing. It wasn't necessary. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't moved. But the act of physically escorting her out wasn't about necessity, it was about dominance. It was about humiliation. It was about making an example out of her. A murmur spread through the courtroom, some whispering, others watching with silent anticipation. There was an unspoken energy in the room, a tension that flickered just beneath the surface. Some people relished the moment, entertained by the spectacle. Others watched in quiet discomfort, feeling the injustice but unwilling to challenge it. And still, she said nothing. She allowed it. Allowed the moment to stretch, allowed him to believe he was winning, allowed him to think he was in control. She didn't fight back. Didn't plead. Didn't argue. And that unsettled him. For the first time, he hesitated, just slightly, as he gripped her arm. Her eyes, sharp, unreadable, met his. There was something in them. Not fear. Not anger. Not defiance. Something else. Something colder. Something measured. She knew something he didn't. But he was too blinded by his own ego to see it. The courtroom doors swung open behind them, the sound echoing through the silent space. He began to lead her toward them, fully expecting this to be the moment where she would crumble, where she would break. This was supposed to be the moment where she realized she didn't belong. But victories built on arrogance are fragile. Because he had no idea. No idea who he had just put his hands on. No idea who he had just humiliated in front of an entire courtroom. No idea that the woman he had just accused, the woman he had just mocked, the woman he had just dragged out of a courtroom like she was nothing, was not just some random black woman. She was the highest-ranking official in the FBI. And when he found out, His entire world would collapse. Because what happened next? No one saw coming. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to say something important. To every black viewer watching this, you are powerful, you are valuable, and you deserve respect. Racism has no place in our society, and here on Plow of Twist, we stand against injustice in all forms. Stories like this serve as a reminder that truth, dignity, and resilience always win in the end. Now, sit back and enjoy a powerful tale of justice, karma, and an unexpected twist. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another gripping story. Let's get started. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, an unspoken tension crackling in the air like a storm about to break. Every corner of the grand, wood-paneled room bore witness to the silent, calculated exchanges of power that took place daily, but today, something different lingered in the air. A moment was unfolding, one that many had seen before, just another routine reminder of authority, of hierarchy, of who belonged and who did not. But beneath the surface, something far greater was brewing. Something no one had anticipated. Special Agent Naomi Carter stood there, her expression unreadable, her posture straight, her hands steady at her sides. She had learned a long time ago not to react, not to flinch, not to give men like Officer Richard Calloway the satisfaction of seeing her falter. If there was one thing she knew how to do better than anyone, it was wait. She let them dig their own graves. But this time, it wasn't just any man who had overstepped. This time, it was Calloway, the officer who had built his career on intimidation, manipulation, and the unshakable belief that his badge granted him absolute power. And he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't know that yet. No, at this moment, he was reveling in what he thought was his victory. "You don't belong here," Calloway spat, voice firm, sharp, loud enough to make sure everyone in the room heard him. He stood with his hands on his belt, legs apart in a stance of dominance, his smirk barely concealed beneath his cold, detached expression. The badge on his chest gleamed under the courtroom lights, a symbol of power that he had wielded for years without question. "This courtroom isn't for people like you." The words hung in the air, acidic, venomous. Naomi didn't move. She didn't blink. She let the moment stretch, let the weight of his arrogance fill the space between them. The people around them watched in silent discomfort. The attorneys sitting at their tables avoided eye contact, their pens scratching over legal pads in feigned distraction. The jury members shifted in their seats. Some of them looked curious. Others looked indifferent. No one said a word. This wasn't new. Everyone had seen moments like this before. A black woman being put in her place by a man in uniform. It was practically routine. But what they didn't know, what Calloway didn't know, was that this wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. Naomi had spent her entire career navigating men like him. She had spent years climbing a ladder that was never meant for people like her to reach the top. Every step had been met with resistance, with roadblocks, with silent, and sometimes not so silent, reminders that she was not supposed to be here. And yet, she had made it. Not just made it, she had risen to the top. She wasn't just another woman walking into a courtroom. She was the highest-ranking official in the FBI. And the man standing before her had just sealed his own fate. But Calloway had no idea. He was still talking, still basking in the moment, still convinced he had control. "You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want?" His voice dripped with condescension. "You think your kind gets a say in how the law works?" A chuckle left his lips, slow, deliberate, meant to humiliate. "You people always think you're smarter than the system. But not today. Not in my courtroom." His courtroom. The arrogance was almost laughable. Calloway turned to the judge with the certainty of a man who had done this before, who knew there would be no consequences for his actions. "Your Honor, this individual is interfering with the legal process and has no business being here. I request that she be removed immediately." The judge barely looked up. The gavel slammed. Bailiff, remove her from the courtroom. A finality settled over the room, a decision made without question, without resistance. It was done. Calloway smirked as he stepped forward, reaching for her arm with slow, deliberate ease, dragging the moment out as if savoring it. The act wasn't necessary. Naomi hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't resisted. But this wasn't about necessity. This was about power. This was about sending a message. A message that Calloway had been sending his entire career. And yet, he had no idea. No idea who he had just put his hands on. No idea that, while he was celebrating his small victory, while he was reveling in his moment of power, the woman standing before him had already orchestrated his entire downfall. No idea that, while he was dragging her toward the courtroom doors, she had already built an airtight case against him, one that would not only cost him his badge but his freedom. Because Naomi hadn't come here by accident. She had come for him. For months, she had been building a case, tracing his steps, uncovering the corruption that had been buried beneath years of falsified reports, missing body cam footage, and conveniently rewritten witness statements. The evidence was all there, every falsified charge, every illegal arrest, every innocent life destroyed by his unchecked authority. And today? Today had been his final mistake. Because what Calloway didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that the moment he had laid his hands on her, he hadn't just made a career-ending mistake. He had walked straight into a trap. And by the time he realized it, by the time the weight of his actions finally sank in, it would already be too late. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Naomi felt the heat of every pair of eyes on her, but she didn't move, didn't break her posture, didn't react the way Calloway wanted her to. His fingers dug into her arm with just enough pressure to remind her that, in his mind, he was in control. The smirk on his face, the arrogant way he squared his shoulders, the way his grip lingered longer than necessary, it was all part of the performance. He wanted her to feel small, to shrink under the weight of his authority. But Naomi had been in rooms far more dangerous than this, surrounded by men far more powerful than Calloway thought he was. And she had never once bowed her head. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself," Calloway muttered, low enough for only her to hear, his breath close, taunting. "Step out quietly, and maybe you won't regret this later." Naomi tilted her head just slightly, enough to meet his eyes. She saw it there, the certainty. He truly believed he had won. Calloway turned back to the courtroom, addressing them like a man who had just carried out justice. "We can now proceed with the case without any more interruptions," he said, exhaling dramatically. "Apologies for the disturbance, Your Honor. Some people just don't understand protocol." The judge barely acknowledged the comment, already moving on. The spectators shifted, some returning to their hushed conversations, others watching Naomi as she was led through the doors. She could have stopped this at any moment. One word. One flash of her credentials. But she didn't. Not yet. The hall outside was empty, save for another officer standing by the door, watching without interest as Calloway released her with a satisfied chuckle. "See, that wasn't so hard, was it?" he said, stepping back, rolling his shoulders like he had just completed some tedious task. "I don't know what you were hoping to accomplish in there, but I hope you get the message. This isn't a place where people like you get to bend the rules." Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, measured. "People like me?" Calloway scoffed, shaking his head. "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. You can dress it up, talk all professional, but at the end of the day, you're just another one of them. You think you're different because you put on a suit and speak a little smarter. You think that changes anything?" Naomi took a slow step forward, forcing him to meet her eyes again. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you?" Calloway smirked, tilting his head. "I don't think. I know." A beat of silence passed between them. Naomi held it, let him believe he was winning, let the arrogance swell in his chest. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket. Calloway tensed for half a second before she pulled out a small card and held it up. His smirk faltered. The FBI badge gleamed under the hallway lights. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. His eyes darted between the badge and her face, as if his brain was trying to catch up, to process the weight of what was unfolding. "You're joking," he said, though there was no humor in his voice. Naomi took a slow breath, letting the moment stretch just a little longer before she finally spoke. "Special Agent Naomi Carter. Lead investigator on the ongoing federal case against you." Calloway's entire body stiffened. The hallway suddenly felt too small, too quiet. The other officer, the one who had been standing idly by, shifted uncomfortably, eyes flickering to Calloway as if waiting for some kind of reaction. Naomi watched it happen in real time, the unraveling. The realization. The weight of everything sinking in. "I've spent the last year investigating every case you've ever manipulated," Naomi continued, voice steady, unwavering. "Every false charge, every fabricated piece of evidence, every missing body cam recording. I have everything, Calloway. And you just made my job even easier." The arrogance was gone now. In its place was something else. Panic. Calloway's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his sides. His mind was working overtime, trying to salvage control, trying to figure out if there was a way to talk himself out of this. You think you can just," he stopped, exhaled sharply, running a hand over his mouth. "This is a mistake. You're twisting this into something it's not. I was doing my job. You were out of line, and I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call it?" "You don't have anything on me," he snapped, a little too quickly. "If you did, I'd already be in handcuffs." Naomi let out a small, almost amused breath. "I don't rush things, Calloway. Unlike you, I believe in due process." For the first time, his confidence cracked. He took a half step back, jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle twitch. And then, his phone buzzed. He barely glanced at it, but Naomi saw the way his fingers trembled when he pulled it out of his pocket. Saw the way his face drained of color when he read whatever message had just come through. Naomi already knew what it was. She had timed it perfectly. Because at that very moment, back in the courtroom, the federal agents she had stationed were making their move. The warrant for Calloway's arrest was being processed. The evidence was being revealed. The case that he thought was his victory was crumbling before his eyes. And this was only the beginning. Naomi leaned in slightly, voice just low enough for only him to hear. "You're about to find out what it feels like when the system you've been abusing finally turns against you." Calloway's breathing had turned shallow. His eyes darted toward the courtroom door, like he was contemplating running. Naomi tilted her head, studying him. "What's wrong, Officer Calloway? You don't look so sure of yourself anymore." The hallway lights seemed brighter now, harsher. The walls seemed closer. The silence heavier. Naomi had seen this before. The moment a man realizes he's lost everything. But what Calloway didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to comprehend, was that the worst was still coming. Because in just a few moments, when he stepped back into that courtroom, when he saw what was waiting for him inside, his entire world would collapse. And there wouldn't be a single thing he could do to stop it. Calloway stepped back instinctively, his pulse hammering in his ears, the walls of the courtroom seeming to close in around him. The murmurs in the room had turned into a low roar, a mixture of shock, curiosity, and anticipation. Every pair of eyes was on him now, not with respect, not with deference, but with something else. Recognition. He wasn't the officer in control anymore. He was the man about to lose everything. His mind raced, searching for an escape, a way to flip this, to regain the dominance that had always come so easily to him. But the sight of the federal agents, standing near the prosecution's table, waiting with unnerving patience, told him the truth he wasn't ready to accept. There was no escape. His hands clenched, sweat beading at his temples. He could feel it happening, the slow unraveling, the collapse of everything he had built, everything he had manipulated, everything he had controlled for so long. His breath hitched as Naomi Carter's voice cut through the courtroom, sharp and authoritative, unchallenged. "Your Honor," she said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had already won, "my name is Special Agent Naomi Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am the lead investigator on an ongoing federal case into Officer Richard Calloway." The name landed like a gavel strike, loud, final, inescapable. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The judge's eyes flicked toward Calloway, then back to Naomi, his usually neutral expression hardening with intrigue. The jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Attorneys, who just moments ago had been preparing their own cases, were now entirely focused on what was unfolding in front of them. Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. "Calloway is under federal investigation for multiple counts of falsifying evidence, wrongful arrests, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. Over the past year, we have gathered irrefutable evidence of his involvement in the deliberate fabrication of charges against multiple individuals, primarily black men and women, whom he targeted, manipulated, and falsely incriminated." The words ripped through the courtroom like a blade. A collective gasp. A scramble of whispers. Spectators sat forward in their seats. A reporter in the back of the room furiously typed into his phone, eyes wide with realization. Calloway's stomach twisted, his vision tunneling. He could feel his world slipping, his power vanishing, like sand through his fingers. "This is insane," he snapped, his voice sharper than intended. This is a stunt. You're trying to make a spectacle out of nothing." Naomi didn't blink. "Nothing? Is that what you call dozens of fabricated arrests? Evidence that was intentionally tampered with? Innocent lives that were ruined because you thought your badge made you untouchable? You're twisting this." Calloway barked, his voice cracking at the edges. "You don't have proof of anything." Naomi gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh, but we do." A single nod from her, and one of the agents near the prosecution's table held up a folder. Thick. Heavy. Undeniable. "Inside this file is a complete breakdown of every falsified report you've ever submitted," Naomi continued, her tone eerily calm. "Every false testimony you coerced. Every fabricated drug charge you planted. Every single time you manipulated the justice system for your own gain." The air in the room thickened. The judge shifted forward slightly. "Agent Carter, are you saying that the officer standing in front of me is the subject of an active federal investigation?" "Yes, Your Honor." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "As of this very moment, Richard Calloway is being formally charged under federal law for his crimes against the people he swore to protect." Another gasp. A woman in the front row put a hand to her mouth. A man in the back muttered, "Jesus Christ." The noise swelled again, a storm of disbelief, of satisfaction, of justice unfolding in real time. Calloway felt his chest tighten. His breath came too fast, too shallow. His hands trembled, and he shoved them into fists, willing himself to stay in control, to keep the facade intact. "You can't do this," he ground out, voice low, dangerous. "You don't have the authority." Naomi stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow deafening. "I have every authority." Another agent stepped forward, unfolding a document with deliberate precision. "This is a federal arrest warrant, signed by a federal judge. Richard Calloway, you are officially being taken into custody." Everything stopped. The air, the movement, the whispered speculation, all of it froze. Calloway stared at the warrant, his eyes darting wildly across the document, as if searching for a loophole, an error, something that could undo the nightmare closing in around him. No. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. He was the one who made arrests, not the one being arrested. He was the one who gave orders, not the one receiving them. He was the one untouchable, the one who knew how to play the system, the one who always walked away clean. Except now, there was nowhere to walk. You think this is justice? He spat, anger twisting into desperation. You think this changes anything? The system is still the system. You're just playing into a game you'll never win. Naomi tilted her head slightly, watching him. Studying him. Maybe, she said, voice soft. But today, you lose. A second agent moved in, reaching for Calloway's wrists. The sound of handcuffs clicking open echoed in the silence. His breath hitched. His legs locked. For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway hesitated. He could feel the courtroom closing in, the weight of judgment, of justice, pressing down on him in a way it never had before. He had humiliated others like this. He had taken pleasure in their downfall. And now? Now, he was the one standing in that place. With every set of eyes watching, with every camera recording, with the entire world seeing him for what he really was. A fraud. A criminal. A disgrace. The handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. And with that single sound, Richard Calloway's world ended. Calloway's wrists ached where the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight settling in his chest. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, his entire body locked in resistance, yet his muscles were useless against the inescapable reality of the moment. His pulse thundered so violently in his ears that he barely registered the collective murmur of the packed courtroom, the hushed voices, the gasps, the whispers of shock, of disbelief, of satisfaction. He could feel every single pair of eyes on him. Watching. Judging. Not with the quiet, unquestioning respect he had grown accustomed to, but with something else, something sharper, something colder. Recognition. They were seeing him for what he truly was. Not a protector. Not a man of the law. Not the powerful figure he had spent years crafting himself to be. But a fraud. A criminal. A disgrace. He could barely breathe. The room was hot, suffocating, closing in around him, yet his skin was ice cold, his veins filled with something dark and heavy, fear. Real fear. Not the kind he had instilled in others for years, not the artificial dominance he had wielded over helpless victims as he stood above them, dictating their fates. This was different. This was terror. And it was his turn to feel it. Detective Richard Calloway, the federal agent to his left spoke, his voice even, calculated, ruthless. You are under arrest for multiple counts of falsifying evidence, wrongful imprisonment, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words sliced through him, ringing in his skull, a cruel echo of the very same warning he had given countless people before dragging them away, shoving them into cells, tearing their lives apart without a second thought. But this couldn't be real. It wasn't real. It wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. His jaw tightened, teeth grinding together, every nerve in his body screaming fight, 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 but for the first time in his life, there was no fight left to win. His voice came out sharp, breaking at the edges, dripping with desperation. No, 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 this is some kind of setup. You don't have anything. You're making a mistake. Naomi Carter stepped forward, her expression unreadable, her presence towering, unyielding. Oh, Calloway, she murmured, tilting her head slightly, her eyes studying him with unshaken patience, you of all people should know, we don't make mistakes. His stomach lurched. You set me up, he spat, breath heavy, voice shaking under the weight of panic he could no longer hide. You baited me. You wanted me to make a move, you waited for it. Naomi let out a slow breath, almost amused. I didn't have to bait you. You did exactly what you always do. Calloway's throat tightened, a fire raging in his chest. You thought you were untouchable, Naomi continued, her voice cutting through the space between them with brutal precision. You thought you could humiliate whoever you wanted. You thought you could twist the law however it suited you. But the truth is, Calloway, you were just a little man with a little power, and now the game is over. The words landed like a hammer, and for the first time, Calloway felt his legs weaken beneath him. His eyes darted around wildly, looking for someone, anyone, to come to his defense. The judge. The jury. The other officers in the room. The men he had worked alongside, the men who had covered for him, who had benefited from him. But none of them spoke. None of them moved. None of them were willing to fall with him. The silence was damning. You all think this is justice? His voice cracked, but he forced it out, his chest rising and falling too fast, the walls pressing in. You think this changes anything? The system still stands. This doesn't change the way the world works. You think dragging me out of here in cuffs makes a difference? Naomi's gaze didn't waver. Oh, I know the system still stands. But today, it turns against you. Calloway jerked back, trying to shake off the hands gripping him, trying to claw his way out of this, but it was too late. The lead agent pulled out a document with deliberate precision. This is a federal arrest warrant, signed by a federal judge. You are officially being taken into custody. The courtroom exploded in noise. Gasps. Stifled laughter. A low murmur of satisfaction. A woman near the back let out a soft, "About time." A reporter lifted his phone to record. Officer Calloway, do you have anything to say about your arrest? The sound of cameras clicking, the flashes blinding. Calloway felt his lungs closing in, his breath shallow, his throat dry. No, he rasped, shaking his head, his entire body trembling now. No, you can't, this isn't, I need a lawyer. You can't just. But they could. They already had. The grip on his arms tightened, his body jerked forward, the final walk beginning. His heart slammed against his ribs, his vision swam, the world tilted as he was dragged toward the courtroom doors. And just as they swung open, just as the press and the flashing cameras and the entire world were about to consume him whole, Calloway turned, one last time, locking eyes with Naomi Carter. She stood there, calm, unwavering, her hands folded behind her back. She watched him the way he had watched so many others fall before him. And then she spoke. Enjoy the trial, Calloway, she murmured, her voice soft, deadly, final. You'll finally get to see what a real courtroom looks like, from the other side. And then, the doors swung shut. The last moment of his power, his control, his life as he knew it, gone. The echo of the courtroom doors slamming shut reverberated through Calloway's skull, a sound so final it sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through his gut. The hallway outside was a storm of flashing lights, cameras snapping at a relentless pace, microphones shoved in his direction as voices overlapped, questions hurled at him from every angle. Officer Calloway, do you deny the allegations? Were you acting alone or as part of a larger cover-up? Do you believe this is a politically motivated takedown? His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind a mess of static, his legs heavy, uncooperative as the federal agents guided him through the chaos. He had escorted people through this very hallway before, had seen men and women stumble under the same crushing pressure, their reputations burning under the heat of public scrutiny. But now it was him. He clenched his jaw, his hands balled into fists even as the cuffs dug into his wrists. He had been in control for so long, had commanded so much fear, had dictated the fate of others with a single signature, a single order, a single lie. And now? Now he was being paraded like a criminal. The press swarmed, reporters scrambling over one another, their lenses trained on him like predators circling wounded prey. You're making a mistake, he snarled, jerking against the agent's hold, his voice ragged, raw. I need to talk to someone, this is a setup. You have the wrong damn guy. No one flinched. No one hesitated. No one listened. Naomi Carter followed a few steps behind, her pace unhurried, her face unreadable. Calloway could feel her presence, could feel her watching, and it ignited a rage so deep, so consuming, that it nearly drowned out his panic. You, he spat, turning his head over his shoulder, desperate for something, anything to make her falter. You did this. You think this makes you different? You think this makes you better than me? Naomi didn't react. You're still part of the system, he pushed, his voice rising, eyes wild. You think you're cleaning up the mess. The system is bigger than you. It's always been bigger than you. This means nothing. She finally stopped walking, letting the agents continue ahead with him. The hallway stretched between them, filled with voices, with movement, with the collapse of everything Calloway had once believed untouchable. And still, she just watched. You're right, she said at last, her voice steady, quiet, dangerous. The system is bigger than me. But today, Calloway. It just swallowed you whole. His stomach lurched. A door swung open ahead, and suddenly, they were outside. The humid air hit him like a brick, thick with the weight of the moment, the pressure of reality sinking into his bones. A police transport van waited at the curb, its doors open, the inside dark, unwelcoming. He twisted again, his voice raw with desperation, with rage. I want a lawyer. Do you hear me? I want a goddamn lawyer. The agent at his side barely acknowledged him. You'll get one. And that was it. No further discussion. No regard. Nothing. He wasn't Calloway the respected officer anymore. He wasn't the man with connections, with authority, with fear at his back. He was just another prisoner in cuffs, another headline, another cautionary tale. They shoved him into the van. The doors slammed. Darkness. The reality of his downfall wrapped around him, suffocating, inescapable. The precinct was quieter than he had ever heard it. He had spent years owning this place, walking through these halls with the kind of power that made people stand straighter, talk softer, look away. His name had meant something here. But now? Now the officers who had once shaken his hand, laughed at his jokes, turned a blind eye to his actions, wouldn't even look at him. Some stood along the walls, watching, their eyes unreadable. Others were stiff, their expressions forced into neutrality, but Calloway could see it in their faces. The relief. The satisfaction. They had waited for this. The men who had always covered for him, always kept their mouths shut, always let him get away with it, they had been waiting for the day someone took him down. And the worst part? They weren't going down with him. He had spent so long believing he was protected, believing he was part of a system that would never turn against him. But the moment he had fallen, the moment he had become a liability, the system had left him behind without a second thought. He was alone. Officer Calloway, a voice cut through the silence, and he looked up sharply. Not officer anymore. Just Richard Calloway. The processing officer at the front desk barely looked at him as he opened the intake forms. Remove his cuffs. The cold metal snapped free, but Calloway didn't feel relief. Because now, he was just another man standing on the wrong side of the law. Strip him of his badge, his gun, his belt, the officer continued, his voice void of the usual respect Calloway had grown so accustomed to. A younger officer, someone Calloway had never paid much attention to, stepped forward, his hands deliberate, practiced, detached. Calloway's badge was pulled from his chest. His gun, the very thing that had made him feel powerful, untouchable, was removed from its holster. The belt that had been a part of him for years, unfastened, taken, discarded. Piece by piece, the identity he had built, the status he had used as a shield, was stripped away. By the time it was over, he wasn't a cop anymore. He was a prisoner. A door buzzed open, and Calloway felt a hand on his arm. Time to go. He resisted. Just for a second. Just to see if he still had any fight left in him. But there was nothing. No one. He was led through another set of doors, down a hallway, into a holding cell. The walls were dull gray, the stench of sweat and metal heavy in the air. A bench against the wall, a toilet in the corner, a single barred window too high to reach. The door shut behind him. He was alone with the silence. The finality of it settled in his chest, a weight so heavy it made it hard to breathe. For years, he had decided fates, had played God with people's lives. Now it was his fate being decided. And there wasn't a single thing he could do about it. The cold from the concrete bench seeped into Calloway's skin as he sat motionless in the holding cell, his hands resting limply on his knees, his mind a chaotic blur of fragmented thoughts. The silence was heavy, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The only sounds were the occasional buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant murmur of voices from the station beyond the thick metal bars. He had spent years on the other side of these walls, standing outside these very cells, looking in at the men he had put there. He had been the one issuing orders, the one controlling fates, the one watching as people broke apart under the weight of confinement. He had never once imagined himself in this position. Now, stripped of his badge, his gun, his power, he had nothing left. A shadow moved beyond the bars, and his pulse spiked, his body going rigid. The heavy clank of a key turning in the lock made his breath catch in his throat, and then the door creaked open. He expected another officer, another agent, maybe someone from internal affairs coming to interrogate him, to remind him of what he had lost, to finalize the paperwork that would send him from this cell straight into a prison transport van. But it wasn't an officer. Naomi Carter stepped inside, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes locked onto his with quiet calculation. She didn't rush, didn't speak immediately, didn't betray even a flicker of emotion. She simply stood there, studying him the way a scientist might observe a failed experiment. Calloway forced out a bitter chuckle, though the sound was hollow, lifeless. "Come to gloat, Agent Carter." She tilted her head slightly, her posture still composed, arms crossed over her chest. "I don't need to. Your face says it all." He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "You think this makes you different? You think putting me in here changes anything?" Naomi didn't blink. "I think it changes everything." Calloway let out a dry laugh, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. His voice dropped lower, his tone laced with something sharp, something dangerous. "You really believe this system is gonna clean itself up just because you cut off one piece of the rot?" He shook his head again, his lip curling slightly. "You're a damn fool if you think I was the only one. You think I operated alone. You think I was some rogue cop running wild while everyone else was innocent. No. I did what I did because it was expected of me. Because this is how the system works. And you?" He scoffed, eyes narrowing. "You're still a part of it, Carter. No matter how much you pretend otherwise." Naomi's jaw tightened, her fingers curling against her arm, but her voice remained steady, controlled. "You're right. The system is still broken. It still protects men like you. It still looks the other way. But today..." She exhaled slowly. "It didn't." Calloway felt his stomach knot, but he didn't let it show. He leaned back against the cold wall, his smirk forced, stretched thin. "So what now? You gonna make an example out of me? Parade me around like some kind of warning? You think that's gonna stop the next cop from doing what I did?" Naomi took a step forward, her eyes dark, piercing. "No. But it'll make sure you never do it again." His smirk wavered. She saw it. And that was the moment she knew, he wasn't just angry. He was scared. Calloway inhaled sharply through his nose, looking away. The weight of it all, the handcuffs, the arrest, the reality of what awaited him, it was finally settling in. He thought he had been untouchable. He had believed the system would always protect him, that his badge would shield him, that no matter how many people he trampled over, no matter how many lives he destroyed, he would always walk away clean. But he wasn't walking away this time. Naomi let the silence stretch before she spoke again. You ever think about them? Calloway frowned, looking back at her. Who? The people you put away, she said, her voice quieter now, heavier. The ones who sat right where you're sitting. The ones who begged, who swore they were innocent, who told you they had nothing to do with the crimes you accused them of. The ones whose lives you destroyed because it was convenient. His throat went dry. She took another step forward, her gaze unwavering. Did you ever stop to think, even once, about what happened to them after you were done with them? When you walked out of the precinct at the end of the day, went home, had dinner, slept in your bed, did you ever think about where they were? About the families they never got to see again? About the jobs they lost? The homes they couldn't afford to keep? The reputations you shattered? Calloway clenched his jaw, his fists balling at his sides. You don't know what it's like to wear the badge. You don't know the kind of pressure we were under, pressure. Naomi's voice turned sharp, incredulous. You mean the pressure to ruin lives? To plant evidence? To fabricate charges that tore families apart? That pressure. Calloway swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. You think this is justice, Carter? His voice was quieter now, raspier. You think locking me up fixes anything? Naomi studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. Justice? She shook her head. No. This isn't justice, Calloway. Justice would be undoing every case you corrupted. Justice would be giving back the years you stole from innocent people. Justice would be you feeling even an ounce of the pain you caused. Her voice softened just slightly. This is just accountability. And it's long overdue. Calloway looked away, his breath shaky, his shoulders tense. Naomi let the silence settle between them, thick and unforgiving. Then she turned, walking toward the door. She paused just before stepping out, glancing back over her shoulder one last time. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I don't think you started out this way. But at some point, you stopped caring about right and wrong. And now? Now you get to see what it feels like when the system you thought would always protect you finally turns against you. And with that, she walked out, leaving Calloway alone in the cold, empty cell. For the first time in his life, he had no power. No shield. No badge to hide behind. Nothing but the crushing weight of everything he had done. The cold air in the cell wrapped around Calloway like a suffocating fog. The weight of silence pressed against him, thick, unforgiving. He sat motionless, his fingers curled against his knees, his breath slow, uneven. His whole body was tense, locked in place by the sheer finality of it all. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. His power was gone. For the first time in his life, there was no one left to cover for him. No one left to protect him. No department willing to back him up. He had spent his whole career believing he was untouchable. And now? Now he was just another inmate waiting for his sentence. A heavy clank of metal echoed through the corridor. He didn't move, didn't lift his head. Footsteps approached, steady, deliberate. He knew that walk. Knew the rhythm of it. Naomi Carter. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his palms over his face before finally looking up. She stood just outside the bars, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. He scoffed, shaking his head. Back again? What, you can't stay away? Naomi didn't smile, didn't smirk, didn't react to the bitterness in his voice. I had a feeling you'd have a lot of time to think. Calloway let out a humorless laugh. And let me guess, you're here to see if I've had some kind of grand epiphany? She tilted her head slightly. Have you? His jaw tightened. He leaned back against the cold wall, tapping his fingers against his knee. You really think locking me up fixes everything, Carter? You think this makes things right? Naomi's gaze didn't waver. I don't think anything can make this right. But I do think this is the first time in your life you've actually had to face the consequences of what you've done. Calloway exhaled sharply through his nose, a dry, bitter sound. And that makes you feel good, doesn't it? Watching me fall. Naomi shook her head. You still think this is about me? It's not. Calloway rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the rough scratch of his unshaven face. Then what the hell are you doing here? Naomi stepped closer to the bars. I want to know something, she said, her voice quiet, careful. When did you stop caring? He frowned, caught off guard by the question. What? She studied him, her expression unwavering. At what point did you stop giving a damn about the truth? About justice? About the people you were supposed to protect? Calloway's throat tightened, his shoulders going rigid. You weren't always like this, she continued, her voice lower now, almost reflective. I've read your file. I've seen the reports. You started off as a damn good cop. You took down real criminals. You were the kind of officer people trusted. So what changed? When did you decide it was easier to fabricate cases than to actually solve them? Calloway clenched his jaw, looking away. Was it pressure? Naomi asked, taking another step forward. Was it survival? Or did it just stop mattering to you? His fingers curled into fists. You don't know what it was like, he muttered. Then tell me, she pressed. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. You get into this job thinking you're gonna make a difference. Thinking you're gonna be the good guy. And then you see how the world really works. You see the politics. You see the people with money, with influence, with connections. And you realize, justice isn't about right or wrong. It's about who has power and who doesn't. Naomi's expression didn't change, but he could tell she was listening. You play by the rules, and you get eaten alive, he continued, his voice bitter, rough. So yeah, I learned how to play the system instead. You think I was the only one? Hell no. I just got caught first. Naomi exhaled, shaking her head slowly. That's the excuse you tell yourself, isn't it? That you were just surviving. Calloway's eyes darkened. I didn't ask for your pity, Carter. You're not getting any, she said flatly. Silence stretched between them. Heavy. Suffocating. For the first time since this all started, Calloway felt exposed. Not as a cop, not as an officer, not as a man in power, but as a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to hide behind. Naomi took a slow breath, steadying herself. You say the system was rigged, that you were just playing the game. But you didn't just bend the rules, Calloway. You broke people. Innocent people. You sent men and women to prison knowing they didn't belong there. You planted evidence. You lied under oath. And for what? A promotion? A reputation? A little extra cash? Calloway's hands clenched. Did you ever think about them? Naomi asked, her voice quieter now, more pointed. About the people whose lives you wrecked? He had thought about them. In the quiet moments, when the adrenaline had worn off, when the noise in his head had settled, he had thought about them. But he had pushed it down. Buried it. Ignored it. Because if he let himself care, if he let himself feel it, then he'd have to admit he was everything he once swore he'd never become. You're asking me questions you already know the answers to, he muttered, his voice rough. Naomi studied him for a long moment. Maybe I just wanted to hear you say it. Calloway swallowed hard, looking down. You're going to prison, Naomi said, her voice quiet but firm. There's no getting out of this. No department is coming to save you. No judge is cutting you a deal. You'll be in front of a jury soon. And for the first time in your life, you won't be the one deciding someone else's fate. Calloway's chest felt tight, his throat dry. He had always been the one standing in the courtroom, watching as verdicts were handed down, knowing that his word, his testimony, his badge carried more weight than the people standing trial. Now he would be the one in the defendant's chair. Now his own fate would be in the hands of people who had every reason to hate him. Naomi's voice softened just slightly, but the weight of her words sank into him like lead. Maybe for the first time, you'll understand what it's like to be powerless. He wanted to snap at her. Wanted to spit out some last shred of defiance. But he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Naomi didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. "Good luck, Calloway," she murmured. "You're going to need it." And then she was gone. Leaving him alone. With nothing left but the weight of his own choices. The courtroom was at full capacity again, every seat filled, every corner occupied, the air thick with anticipation. But this time, Richard Calloway was not the one standing in front of the judge with his chest puffed out, authority at his back. This time, he was the one stripped of everything that once made him untouchable. He sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap, his posture unnaturally rigid. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but the words barely registered. His focus was on the judge, the weight of the final verdict pressing down on him like a crushing force. 2 hours earlier, the jury had delivered its decision. Guilty. On every count. There had been no hesitations. No deadlocks. No room for doubt. Now, all that remained was the sentencing. Calloway knew, deep down, that there was no hope for leniency. He had seen the case unfold from the defendant's chair, powerless as Naomi Carter and her team dismantled every single lie, every false report, every shred of manipulation he had ever committed. The evidence had been irrefutable. The testimonies had been damning. The faces of the people he had wrongfully convicted, the families he had torn apart, the lives he had destroyed, they had been in that courtroom, watching as the walls closed in on him, waiting for the moment when the justice system, for once, turned against the very man who had twisted it for so long. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his body tense with an emotion he refused to name. Regret? Fear? It didn't matter. It wouldn't change anything now. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze firm, unforgiving as he looked down at the man who had once been on the other side of these proceedings, passing judgment instead of receiving it. Detective Richard Calloway, the judge began, his voice calm but carrying the undeniable weight of finality, "You have spent years abusing the power granted to you by this state, by this country, by the very people who trusted you to uphold the law with integrity. Instead, you used your authority to falsify evidence, wrongfully imprison innocent individuals, obstruct justice, and perpetuate a culture of corruption and abuse." Calloway felt his chest tighten, but he remained silent, staring down at the polished wood of the table in front of him. "You operated under the belief that you were untouchable," the judge continued. "That your actions would never be scrutinized. That you would never have to face consequences. Today, this court has proven otherwise." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "Richard Calloway," the judge said, his voice steady, final, "you are hereby sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The words landed like a gavel strike to the chest. The sound of the real gavel echoed through the courtroom, slamming down onto the bench with a force that sealed Calloway's fate permanently. He barely had time to breathe before officers stepped forward, gripping his arms as they pulled him to his feet. The handcuffs snapped back around his wrists, the cold bite of the steel a painful reminder of where he now stood in the world. He wasn't feared anymore. He wasn't respected anymore. He was just another convicted criminal, being led away like so many others before him. As he turned toward the exit, his gaze locked onto Naomi Carter. She was seated near the front, calm, unwavering, composed. She had not come to mock him, had not come to enjoy his downfall. She had come because this wasn't about revenge. It had never been about revenge. This had been about justice. And now, justice had finally been served. Their eyes met for a moment, one brief, silent second where everything that had led to this moment hung between them. There was nothing left to say. Then, the officer beside him tugged him forward, and Richard Calloway was escorted out of the courtroom for the last time. The doors swung shut behind him. Gone. Outside the courthouse, Naomi Carter stepped into the crisp afternoon air, inhaling deeply as the tension that had gripped her body for months finally began to release. The case was over. The fight had been won. But the work? The work never ended. The press had already gathered, reporters shouting questions, microphones being shoved forward, cameras flashing like firecrackers in the chaos. Agent Carter. What does this verdict mean for the future of corruption investigations? Do you believe this will set a precedent for police accountability? How many more officers are under investigation? Naomi ignored them all. Justice had been served today. But there would be more cases. More investigations. More corruption to uncover. More battles to fight. The system was still flawed. But today, the system had done exactly what it was supposed to do. And that was enough. But now, I want to ask you something. This story wasn't just about one man's downfall. This was about power, corruption, and accountability. It was about a man who believed he was above the law until the law finally caught up with him. But let's be honest, how many more Calloways are still out there? How many officers, officials, politicians, and people in power are still manipulating the system, still bending the rules to protect themselves, still making sure that they never have to face what Calloway faced today? And how many more lives will be ruined before they're finally held accountable? Was this justice? Or was this just one victory in a war that is far from over? I want to hear your thoughts. Tell me, do you believe the system is finally changing? Or do you think this was just an exception, a rare moment where the truth actually won? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, stories about power, corruption, and the unexpected twists that bring the truth to light, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.